All right, so finally, in the Ezra Nehemiah book that has now become two books, we have the story of Nehemiah, and his job is to go back and build the walls. And for us, this might seem like kind of a strange ending to the story of the people's return. But can you see any way in which this is kind of appropriate? Why would the story end here with the rebuilding of the walls?
It is the extent of the city.
Right.
And it is, I mean, a king's job is to start from the center and work out. And so if we're establishing the limits of the city to protect that which was within inside, just like the garden, I suppose.
Yeah.
It is the thing that keeps all the stuff out or in.
Right. It's the point where we define what's inside and what's outside. We include and we exclude. And every city, every organism, every thing has to do that. Even the word thing, which is very inclusive, has to have some limits. Otherwise, it's not very useful. So Nehemiah really wraps this up, and that's kind of his job. Is he's defining physically what's inside the city and what's outside the city, but there's a spiritual aspect of defining what's inside the city and outside the city. Are those two things always the same? Is the physical definition and the spiritual definition, are those things always the same?
Always?
Yeah.
Probably not, but I suppose there's a great deal of overlap there.
If I live inside the city limits, or if I am inside the city limits, am I automatically a part of the city?
Yeah, so no, not always. I mean, you can have a spy, I suppose, that is pretending. We like to say or think that that distinction is true, but it isn't always true, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that we're often very short-sighted in seeing the physical as the sum total of the reality, but most of these things are not physical, they're spiritual. And so both of these issues come up in the book of Nehemiah, and one of the things that happens is that they have this great feast of booths, and there's a reading of the law, and there's this passage about do not weep or mourn, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And if you just look at that one verse, which is very, very famous,
and bumper sticker
knowledge,
right?
When you put it in the context of Nehemiah, is there a greater meaning? Does this verse help us kind of define the city?
For sure. Once you're in the city, you're God's people, and there's joy found in His presence. And outside of the city is not God's people or God's presence. So there is no joy there, or less joy, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say that it's actually a great way of kind of defining the city. That the city is where joy in the Lord is found, and everything else is where there is no joy in the Lord. There's a spirit, and that's really kind of the definition of the spiritual city. You can be inside the city and not be joyful in the Lord, and so physically you're part of the city, but if you really want to be part of the city spiritually, then you have to have joy in the Lord. Now, is there any connection between that which is going on in Nehemiah and the definition of the city and what we experience as Christians? Is there any carryover between that and the church?
Well, sure. The church is the shining light. The Spirit's reach across the globe, so to speak. But we're in a constant state of trying to build the wall, I suppose, in our own life and build who we are and our understanding of God. That's a joyful thing. It ought to be.
I mean, if somebody is inside the church but they're not joyful in God, are they? I mean, you can attend church every week. And
sure.
You can,
Sure.
Does that mean that you're? The problem is always mistaking the physical for the spiritual.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that you're joyful in the happy realm as a Christian at all times.
Right.
Obviously, there's a more complete understanding of the emotions that any Christian can feel, of course. But I believe that the the state of your heart and your mind unified in its purpose as a Christian, knowing who you are in regards to God, that's a joyful state. I mean, when I said earlier that we are constantly building the wall, I mean, I'm imagining our bodies, and our minds and our bodies are under construction, and we're taking care of that thing and making sure that it's being built well.
So one of the things that takes place with Nehemiah is that, again, there's conflict, and there's kind of an anticlimax or an underwhelming ending where Nehemiah is having trouble with the locals, and so the people that are building the walls are having to build it with a shield and a spear, in one hand, and then doing the masonry work with the other hand, and the people kind of are the wall there until the wall gets built, and there's a lot that you can see symbolically from this. But this conflict then is carried all through all three stories of kind of defining Israel. And there's this Feast of Booths that takes place, which is two things. It's gratitude for God taking care of them in the wilderness, but it's also at the end of it, the Feast of Booths, you have this sacrifice of 70 bulls, which is about the 70 nations of the world and the idea of being a priest to them. And so you have this tension between trying to define who's inside the city and who's outside the city, but then also a feast that was representative of reaching out to the entire world. At the same time, you're pushing people out of your city. So there's this tension going on, and it kind of culminates at the end of the story with Nehemiah looking around and seeing how all the parts of the work have been undone. Zerubbabel's temple is filled with people who are unqualified to work and to do the work and not really interested in doing the work. Ezra has his community is full of people that are breaking the laws of the Sabbath, and then Nehemiah has problems with his wall being used as kind of a storefront for people who are also breaking the Sabbath. And so he kind of runs around screaming at people and beating them and stuff like that. Why do you think the book ends here? It's very strange.
It's a good question. Ultimately, none of these people can fulfill the perfect solution to the temple's building. And I think Nehemiah's like, I did as good as I could, right?
Yeah.
But what did he have to work with? Imperfect people, his own imperfection, and an imperfect world. Ultimately, it isn't until Christ comes that this perfection makes it possible for the work to be completed.
Yeah. I think that there's the tension that we've seen in all of this, is the understanding that really what the prophets were prophesying about was not a physical kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom. It's the kingdom that can work, because there's all these things that are held in tension and are really kind of opposed to each other, and trying to build this physical kingdom that don't exist in a spiritual kingdom, but we're not there yet. And so there's a disappointing end to this, because this isn't the end. The end is Christ in the church. But I think there's also a lesson to us in just kind of these guys doing the best that they can, because often in lieu of perfection, we want to give up. And because they didn't give up, Jesus had a context to be born into. And it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for God to use. And so ultimately there is kind of some hope to these stories, but you have to really look for it. And one of the things I love about the Bible is it doesn't sugarcoat things.
I think it's very easy to see ourselves in these stories from the standpoint of the failures or the lack of, that the work needs to be done, and we can do only so much outside of Christ.
Yeah.
And that ultimately we have to rely on His work.